Welcome to the Flower Farm Sampler Quilt-Along series. I'm Shelley Kavana, author of the Flower Farm Sampler book, and it's my mission to help you make stunning quilts simply. If we haven't met before, I'm a quilt pattern and cross-stitch designer. I design fabric and I write quilting books like the Barnstar Sampler and the Flower Farm Sampler. You can find my patterns, fabrics, and books at your favorite local quilt shop, or you can find them online at our website at chorusquilts.com. You can also follow our quilty adventures on social media under the tag @ChorusQuilts. In our Flower Farm Sampler Quilt-Along series, we'll be working through all 18 blocks from my Flower Farm Sampler book, spread out over 12 months. To sew along with us, you'll need your fabric and the book. In these videos, also assume that you've prepped and cut your fabric pieces following the book's instructions. To make the blocks in the book, you won't need any specialty rulers, foundation paper piecing, or templates. Most of the blocks use my favorite stitch and flip techniques to create complex geometric designs with simple shapes. A few of our blocks do include triangles, which will piece oversized and trimmed down to perfection. All the stitch and flip basics are also covered on pages 10 through 13 of your book, so you'll definitely want to bookmark that section for handy reference. Instead of starting with block 1 and working our way chronologically through the book, we're going to begin with our smaller 8-inch blocks. This way we can practice techniques on a manageable scale before tackling our larger and more complicated blocks. You'll find our complete schedule, my list of must-have and nice-to-have tool recommendations, and a free downloadable block checklist so you can keep track of your progress, all on our Quilt-Along homepage. We've left the link to that in the description box below. In this week's video, we're assembling our Forget-Me-Nots block, which is block 16 in your book. This is hands down one of my favorite blocks in the entire sampler, and I think you're going to love it too. This sweet little 4-inch block gives us our first real chance to work with triangle units in this sampler series. While it looks delicate and complex, it's actually really straightforward once you understand how triangles behave. The Forget-Me-Nots is a lovely little cross-stitch inspired block with on-point squares forming a central X pattern. These are surrounded by quarter square and half square triangles to build out the background of the block. I highly recommend making a practice block or two with scrap fabric first. If triangles are new to you, this practice will build some confidence before working with your good fabric. Because this is one of the few blocks we have where we'll be working with triangles, I think it's important to explore a little bit why triangles tend to have a bit of a bad reputation with quilters. So when you take a fabric square and you cut through it at an angle, you're cutting through the warp and the weft. These are the horizontal and vertical fibers of your fabric. Rather than leaving us with a nice, stable, straight cut edge, we now have what is called a stretchy bias edge. And just to show you how unstable triangles can be, here is a quarter square triangle that I've cut from some scrap fabric. The longest edge is our straight grain edge from the original square, and you can see how it has very little stretch. But these two remaining sides are bias edges, and you can see that it takes very little pressure to stretch or skew the fabric. And the frustrating part is that once you've stretched it out of place, you're left with a bit of a misshapen mess that is nearly impossible to get back into its original shape. I'm not trying to frighten you away from working with triangles. I just want to make sure that you understand how gently these pieces have to be handled as you sew with them. And as we're working with blocks that contain triangle units, we want to make sure that we are burying those bias edges within the middle of the block, so that when we're done piecing, we have a stable block that has straight grain or cross grain edges around the perimeter. This way, we're avoiding biased edges that are exposed and stretchable on block edges whenever possible. Our forget-me-not blocks actually use two different kinds of triangle units. Our C triangles are what's called quarter square triangles. We make them by taking a square and cutting it into quarters diagonally. And these triangles have bias edges along two sides, so that when we join them to the squares, making our center X in the block, those bias edges get sewn to their neighbors, and this leaves us with the straight grain edges for the block perimeter. Think of these as your compass point triangles. Our D triangles are what we call half square triangles. We get them by taking a square and cutting it in half diagonally. And these half square triangles have bias edges along just one side, with straight grain edges on the other two sides. These are our corner triangles. And so we'll sew the bias edges to the A square and we'll be left with stable, straight grain corners. This block especially, it is really critical that you carefully label these triangles as you're cutting. There's a huge difference between these two types, even though they're similar in size, and their bias edges will affect how they behave in your block. Because triangle units can be tricky to work with, we are piecing these blocks larger than we need them and then trimming them down to size. This gives us a little wiggle room, a little bit of grace for any slight distortion. And we recommend making a practice block or two before cutting into and using your fabric for your actual quilt. And after your practice blocks, if you feel like you need even more wiggle room, you can cut your C and D squares a 1/4 inch larger than directed in the book before cutting them into their respective triangles. When making these blocks, I always like to lay out all of my pieces on my cutting mat and keep that right next to my machine, just making sure that all of the straight edges of those C and D triangles form the block perimeter, just like we chatted about in the previous section. We'll start our block assembly by sewing our pieces together into diagonal rows. We'll sew the C triangles to the left and right sides of an A square, paying close attention to the orientation of the triangle. Remember that those C triangles have two bias edges, the one that you've joined to the side of your A square and the one along the bottom of your block. So as you're sewing, be careful to not tug or distort those triangles. Let your sewing machine's feed dogs do the work and just use your fingers to guide the triangle through the block. Since you're already at your sewing machine, you should go ahead and chain piece those A and B squares that will come together to form the center row of the block. Before you start pressing, make sure that you trim down your dog ears or bring the tops of those C triangle units flush with the top of the A squares to reduce bulk in your seam allowances. And as you press these rows, be sure to press with care, avoiding pulling on or distorting the bias edges of those C triangles. After you've finished pressing all of your rows, then you're ready to add your D triangles to the corners. Again, trim off the dog ears and then press. When you're ready to start joining your rows together, if you followed the pressing instructions in the book, then the seams between your squares should nest beautifully together. Have a few different options for doing your final pressing of your block. You can absolutely press your seams open to reduce bulk. You can press your rows away from the center of the block as shown in the assembly diagrams in your book, or you can take a few moments and spin your seams for the flattest result, in my opinion. And we covered spinning seams in our bellflower video if you need a refresher. Final step in finishing our forget-me-not blocks is to center and square our units down to 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. And we want to do this not only to get our blocks down to the right size, but to make sure that that center X in our blocks stays perfectly centered within the block. To do this, we're going to go ahead and use a square rotary ruler. And you'll want to line up the 4 corners of that centermost B square with the 2.25 marks on your ruler. This keeps everything centered as you trim off the excess background fabric from the top and right sides. Then simply rotate your block 180 degrees and repeat for the remaining 2 sides. And there you have it, your lovely little forget-me-nots block. Make sure to take a moment and pat yourself on the back. You've just worked through some triangle fundamentals that will serve you so well not only within this quilt, but within countless quilts in the future. Remember that you can find the link to this month's other block, Block 12, which is the Lily block, on our Quilt Along homepage, which is linked below. And next month, we're moving on to Block 15, the Tea Rose block. We'll revisit some stitch and flip rectangle techniques to create these gorgeous spiraling blossoms. We'll see you then. Thanks so much for sewing along with me today. You can post your photos in our Flower Farm Sampler Quilt Along Facebook group or on Instagram and Blue Sky using hashtag Flower Farm Sampler. And be sure to tag us at Chorus Quilts so that we can see your beautiful work too. Don't forget to grab your free Flower Farm Sampler checklist. You can find the link for the free download in the description box below. If you've enjoyed this tutorial, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more quilting videos. Hit the bell icon for notifications when we post new tutorials. Happy sewing, and we'll see you next time with another Flower Farm Sampler blog.